Tyrese Johnson had always been a boy with a heart of gold. Raised by a single mother in a tight-knit neighborhood, he learned early on that helping others was not just a duty, but a way of life. At 17, he was tall, with an athletic build from years of playing basketball, but it was his warm smile and generous nature that everyone in the community knew him for. One Thursday afternoon, after basketball practice, Tyrese decided to stop by the grocery store to pick up some things for his mom. As he walked down the aisles, his thoughts drifted to his future. He was in his senior year, and though he had dreams of going to college on a basketball scholarship, he also knew the importance of having a backup plan. He loved the idea of becoming a teacher or maybe even a social worker, something where he could continue helping people. As he was lost in thought, Tyrese noticed an elderly white woman struggling with a heavy shopping cart. Her silver hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her face, though lined with years, still carried a certain grace. She looked up and met his eyes, giving him a small, tired smile. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," Tyrese offered, stepping forward to take the cart from her. "Oh, you're too kind," the woman said, visibly relieved. "Thank you, young man. I was just about to call for some help." "It's no problem at all," Tyrese replied, his voice full of sincerity. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Peterson, and as they walked through the store together, Tyrese couldn't help but notice the way she spoke with such fondness about the community. She mentioned her late husband, who had passed away a few years ago, and how they had once owned a small bookstore in town. "I miss those days," Mrs. Peterson sighed. "It was hard work, but it was rewarding. My husband loved nothing more than matching people with the perfect book. We had regular customers who would come in just to chat." Tyrese smiled, imagining the cozy little bookstore and the joy it must have brought to the community. "It sounds like you both made a lot of people happy," he said. "We did," she replied with a nostalgic smile. "It's young people like you who give me hope for the future. I see how hard you all work, and it reminds me of my husband's spirit. He always believed in the potential of the youth." As they reached the checkout, Mrs. Peterson began fumbling through her purse for her wallet. Tyrese noticed her struggling and gently placed a hand on her arm. "Don't worry about it, Mrs. Peterson. I've got it," he said, pulling out his own wallet. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly let you do that," she protested, but Tyrese insisted. "It's my pleasure," he assured her, smiling as he handed the cashier the money. Mrs. Peterson looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Tyrese. You've been so kind to me today. It's rare to find such generosity these days." "It's nothing, really," Tyrese replied modestly, though he couldn't help but feel a warm glow inside. "It's just how my mom raised me." As they walked out to the parking lot, Mrs. Peterson offered Tyrese a ride home. He politely declined, preferring to walk the short distance. Before they parted ways, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph of her and her husband standing in front of their bookstore. "Take this, Tyrese," she said, pressing the photo into his hand. "It's a little something to remember me by, and if you ever need a book recommendation, don't hesitate to visit me. My door is always open." Tyrese looked at the photo, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I'll treasure it." As he walked home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Helping Mrs. Peterson had been a small gesture, but it had brightened both of their days. Little did Tyrese know, this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, the Johnson household was a flurry of activity. Tyrese's younger siblings, Caleb and Layla, were running around the kitchen trying to gather their things for school. Their mother, a nurse who worked long shifts at the local hospital, was busy packing their lunches and making sure everyone had what they needed for the day. "Tyrese, can you make sure Caleb has his homework in his backpack?" his mother called from the kitchen. "Got it, Mom," Tyrese replied, grabbing his little brother's backpack and checking it over. As he was getting ready to leave for school, the routine buzz of the household was interrupted by the sound of sirens approaching their street. Tyrese's heart skipped a beat as he looked out the window to see two police cruisers pulling up in front of their house. He felt a surge of anxiety, unsure of what was happening. "What's going on?" his mother asked. her voice filled with concern as she joined him at the window. "I don't know," Tyrese replied, his voice tinged with worry, "but I'm going to find out." Tyrese stepped outside, his mind racing with thoughts of what could possibly be happening. To his shock, Mrs. Peterson stepped out of one of the cars, accompanied by 2 police officers. She looked around nervously before her eyes met his. "Mrs. Peterson?" Tyrese called out, confused and concerned. His mother quickly joined him outside, her face lined with worry as she took in the scene. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Peterson?" Mrs. Peterson seemed anxious as she explained that after Tyrese had helped her the day before, she realized her wallet was missing. At first, she thought she had misplaced it, but after searching everywhere, she couldn't find it and felt compelled to ask if Tyrese had seen it. Tyrese's heart sank. He had been nothing but kind and helpful, and now he was being accused of something he hadn't done. "No, ma'am, I didn't take your wallet. I promise," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The police officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them stepped forward and suggested they conduct a search of the house just to be thorough. Tyrese's mother, though reluctant, agreed to the search in the hope of clearing her son's name. The search was thorough, with the officers going through each room and checking for any sign of the missing wallet. Tyrese and his family watched anxiously, knowing nothing would be found, but feeling humiliated nonetheless. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned to the living room, their expressions serious but resigned. "We didn't find anything," one of them said. "We'll continue our investigation and keep you informed." Mrs. Peterson looked visibly shaken, and Tyrese could see the guilt in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Tyrese. I didn't want to believe it, but I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice wavering. Tyrese wanted to be angry, but he couldn't bring himself to lash out at the elderly woman who had been so kind to him just the day before. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand." As the police left, the weight of the situation settled heavily on Tyrese's shoulders. Word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood, and it wasn't long before everyone seemed to have an opinion on what had happened between Tyrese and Mrs. Peterson. Some neighbors were quick to jump to conclusions, whispering among themselves and casting suspicious glances at Tyrese as he walked down the street. Mrs. Hargrove, who lived 2 doors down, was one of the first to voice her doubts. "I always thought Tyrese was a good kid," she said to her friend over the fence, "but you never really know, do you? It's quite a coincidence, him helping Mrs. Peterson and then her wallet going missing." Others, however, were more supportive and refused to believe that Tyrese could be involved in anything dishonest. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired mechanic who had known Tyrese since he was a little boy, shook his head when he heard the news. "That boy wouldn't hurt a fly," he insisted. "He's always been helpful and respectful. This has to be some sort of misunderstanding." At school, Tyrese's classmates were abuzz with gossip. Some believed Mrs. Peterson's claim, while others staunchly defended Tyrese. His best friend Jamal was particularly vocal in his support. "There's no way Tyrese did this," he told anyone who would listen. "He's the most honest person I know. This is just wrong." Despite the support from his friends and family, Tyrese couldn't escape the feeling of being under a microscope. Every time he walked down the hallways at school or through the streets of his neighborhood, he felt the weight of judgment from those who doubted him. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly trust could be shaken. One evening, a group of neighbors gathered at the local community center for a meeting. The topic of discussion was the recent events surrounding Tyrese and Mrs. Peterson. As people voiced their opinions, the room grew tense. Mrs. Peterson also attended the meeting, looking frail and tired. She stood up to address the crowd, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I've lived in this community for a long time," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "I've always believed in the goodness of my neighbors. The situation with my wallet has been very upsetting, but I don't want to point fingers without cause. Tyrese has always been a respectful young man." Her words brought a momentary silence to the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. The meeting ended with a resolution to support both Mrs. Gramber, Peterson, and Tyrese as the police investigation continued. It was a small step towards healing the rift that the incident had caused in the community. The days passed, and the police continued their work. They interviewed neighbors, retraced Mrs. Peterson's steps, and reviewed security footage from the grocery store. The Johnson family held on to the hope that the investigation would eventually clear Tyrese's name. Until then, they supported each other, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the cloud of suspicion that hung over them. One afternoon, Tyrese was helping Caleb with his homework in the living room. Caleb, who was particularly tech-savvy for a 10-year-old, played on his tablet after finishing his assignments. He loved exploring the internet and was always curious about the latest trends and videos. "Hey, Tyrese, look at this!" Caleb called out suddenly, his eyes wide with excitement. Tyrese walked over to see what had caught his brother's attention. Caleb was watching a video on a popular social media platform. The video showed a group of kids from the neighborhood, one of them being Kevin, a notorious troublemaker. In the footage, Kevin held up a wallet and bragged about how he had taken it from an old woman. "Check this out," Kevin boasted in the video. "I snagged this wallet from that old lady. She didn't even notice." Tyrese's heart pounded as he watched the video. This was it, the proof they needed to clear up the misunderstanding once and for all. He quickly grabbed Caleb's tablet and rushed to show his mother. Mrs. Johnson watched the video, her face a mix of relief and anger. "We need to take this to the police," she said, gathering her keys and telling Tyrese to come with her. When they arrived at the police station, Officer Daniels, who had been handling the case, was there to meet them. They showed him the video, and he watched it with a serious expression. "This changes everything," Officer Daniels said, his tone professional but with a hint of relief. "We'll need to investigate this further, but it seems we've found the real culprit." The police quickly shifted their focus to Kevin and his friends. They visited Kevin's house, and his parents were horrified to learn about the video. Kevin was brought in for questioning, and it wasn't long before he confessed to stealing Mrs. Peterson's wallet. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and the community was in disbelief that Kevin would stoop so low. Meanwhile, Tyrese's name was finally and completely cleared. The weight of the suspicion that had hung over him for so long was finally lifted. Mrs. Peterson, feeling deeply remorseful for having wrongly accused him, visited the Johnson household once more, this time on her own. "Tyrese, I can't thank you enough for what you and your family have done," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry for everything you went through. I was wrong to doubt you, and I hope you can forgive me." Tyrese looked at the elderly woman, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. He felt a wave of compassion wash over him. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson," he said gently. "I understand. It was a mistake, and I'm just glad the truth came out." The neighborhood, which had been divided by the incident, began to rally around Tyrese and his family. Mr. Rodriguez, who had always believed in Tyrese's innocence, organized a small community gathering to celebrate the resolution of the incident. As the sun set on the gathering, Tyrese looked around at the familiar faces, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the support he had received. During the gathering, Mrs. Peterson stood up to make a special announcement. She held a microphone and smiled warmly at the crowd. "Good evening, everyone," she began. "Thank you for coming. I have a very special announcement to make tonight." She glanced at Tyrese, her eyes filled with admiration. "Many of you know about the recent misunderstanding involving Tyrese Johnson and myself. I wrongly accused him of taking my wallet, but through his patience, kindness, and integrity, the truth came to light." The audience murmured in agreement and showed their support for Tyrese. Mrs. Peterson's voice was filled with emotion as she continued. "Tyrese's actions reminded me of the importance of community and the potential each young person holds. To honor his character and support others like him, I have established the Tyrese Johnson Scholarship Fund." There were gasps and cheers from the crowd as Mrs. Peterson explained. "This fund will provide financial assistance to Tyrese and other deserving students in our community. It will help them pursue their educational dreams and build a brighter future." Tyrese's eyes widened with disbelief. He had never expected anything like this. Mrs. Peterson smiled at him, her voice full of sincerity. "Tyrese, you've shown us all what it means to be a true leader. This is my way of saying thank you and ensuring that your kindness continues to inspire others." The room erupted in applause, and Tyrese stood up with tears in his eyes. The recognition and generosity overwhelmed him. It would make his dreams of a better future come true and open doors he could only dream about at that moment. It was simply too much to assimilate. The announcement of the Tyrese Johnson Scholarship Fund brought a wave of celebration throughout the community. The gathering buzzed with excitement as neighbors, friends, and family gathered around Tyrese. They congratulated him and expressed their admiration for his resilience and character. His family felt a profound sense of relief and pride. Mrs. Johnson hugged her son tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You've always made my heart proud, Tyrese, but today you've shown everyone what I've always known. You have a heart of gold." Caleb and Layla looked up at their brother with eyes filled with awe. They hugged him and told him he was their hero. The celebration continued into the evening, with laughter, stories, and a shared sense of unity.